that all of God's human creatures know him by virtue of God revealing himself to them. That is the image of God, as Paul fleshes out what that means in Romans 1, and that's very much the context, 1:18 to 22 particularly, and then he talks later, or talks after that about the common grace of God. But initially he has in mind the knowledge of God that all of God's human creatures have. That knowledge of God is not erased by virtue of the fall. It is rather suppressed in unrighteousness. And even if suppressed, which it is, it's still there. That is, it's the suppression of the truth that renders all of God's human creatures inexcusable before him. So because everyone knows God, you never come into a situation in a discussion of the gospel in which the person to whom you speak has no idea who this God is. Now, there's a facade factor that you always have to include in your discussion. That is, people aren't going to acknowledge that they know God, and I don't think apologetically you're meant to go up to people and say, "Hey, you know God," and you won't acknowledge it. That's not the approach. But given what Paul says, we know that going into a discussion, so that the gospel, when it's communicated, resonates with people because they do know God, and the Spirit of God sovereignly makes his point by virtue of that gospel to someone who is covenantally in a relationship to God. It may be a relationship of rebellion, but it's still a relationship.
Sure.
So that gospel never goes into a vacuous context or a neutral context or a context of agnosticism, but it goes into a context of the knowledge of God suppressed. And it's that point of contact that Van Til emphasizes, and I think rightly says that is our basic point of contact, the Anknüpfungspunkt, as he put it, the point of contact for communication of a defense of Christianity and of the good news of the gospel to people, because God's already been there and he's made himself known. He continues to do that, not only in this life, but in the life to come, whether in heaven or in hell.
Now, you'd mentioned Warfield and Kuyper, and in the introduction to the Defense of the Faith, Van Til consciously acknowledges, he writes that he's borrowing or taking their insights and, so to speak, bridging the gap between them in some ways. Has modern Warfield scholarship or even Kuyperian scholarship changed our view of Van Tilian apologetics over time? Have there been any recent developments that have altered what we see Van Til doing with those two men?
Well, I've been impressed with a good bit of Paul Helseth's work on Warfield and Machen and the way he's trying to get at what the idea of right reason might be in the context of the 19th century particularly. And I think there are places in Van Til where he sometimes overestimates what Warfield and maybe to some extent, I think a lesser extent, Kuyper, but certainly what Warfield's doing. I think he overestimates some of Warfield's trajectories, if I can use that word, but where Warfield might wind up given what he said. Having said that, I think Van Til was on the money, not only in his critique of Warfield, but I think Kuyper and Bavinck as well. And as you know, he appreciated all three of those men much more than he critiqued them. These were not enemies. These were giants that he learned from. But even in the midst of that, I think his critiques were on the mark in the sense that Warfield was perhaps, at least in my view, I think in Van Til's view, a bit too taken with a kind of realistic epistemology. And given that, then a supposition of a kind of neutrality that I think might hurt your methodology if you're wanting to be biblical in the way you approach things. Now, again, I don't think that was by any stretch a predominance in Warfield. I don't think you can make that case at all. So I think what Van Til's pointing out is a glitch here and there that needed to be shored up. I think you see it. I think it's even worse in Kuyper, and I think there are segments, again, small segments, but significant segments in Bavinck that need to be shored up, and that Van Til was rightly shoring up. in order to promote what he saw, and I think what he rightly saw, the Reformed methodology in apologetics.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, in terms of Warfield studies, I think Helseth is basically right. I think he can show that every time a person says reason, they don't mean neutral reason. That's true enough. And I think Van Til may have been a little bit too skittish about that word and the way in which it was used. But having said that, there are things in Warfield, there's no question you can see him, where he is promoting a kind of methodology that's not going to be fundamentally useful because not fundamentally biblical. Now, again, that's a glitch. That's not all of Warfield. I want people to hear that Warfield is worth the reading and the study and everything that he wrote. But still, I think there are little areas there that need to be shored up.
Now, when you mentioned glitch, you're meaning an inconsistency with the confessional Reformed doctrine.
Exactly.
And that's, and I thought that was very interesting. Even Van Til is he's very clear when he writes that he really didn't think he was doing anything original. He was just, and if you were to claim that his apologetic were original, it seems as he would say, well, it's just original in that I'm applying traditional confessional Reformed doctrine to apologetics. That he's not trying to come up with anything brand new.
Yeah, and see, I think that's just a monumentally crucial point, and it's been driven home more and more, at least in my view, as Richard Muller has come out with his massive works on Protestant scholastics. It just strikes me every time I read something with regard to the Protestant scholastics that by and large what they're doing and what they're saying is what Van Til was doing and saying. So in my, and it'll be obvious here that I'm no historian, but at least in my Reformed historiography, what I see is consistency by and large in the 17th century, a kind of blip at Princeton that again is not predominant, but is certainly there. And then I see Van Til picking up more of what was going on in the Protestant scholastics and simply applying Reformed theology to his apologetic methodology. Now, I think the reason for that, Van Til himself would admit he's not a historian, a church historian, but see, because he was so influenced by Bavinck, and now that we have Bavinck's volume, well, you can see this in the Dutch as well if you look at the footnotes, but you see Bavinck's dependence on the 17th century and so much of what he says, and so Van Til just sort of imbibed that by way of Bavinck and began to articulate his views early on, and I think it's because he had that influence that he was able to apply Reformed theology more consistently to apologetic methodology. But Van Til never saw himself as a real innovator. He just he gained an insight and then wrote about it, and I think that's what the best of Reformed theology does.
Do you think he did that or didn't write as much on the Trinity because he thought the same thing?
Because he thought what?
Because he thought he was just following in the footsteps of the men before him, that his Trinitarian theology wasn't very original?
Oh, I'm sure of it. Yeah, I don't think he. I at least, and granted, I didn't know him until later on in his life. But there's no question in his own mind he didn't think he was doing anything original there, nor would he have wanted to. Mm-hmm. There's a good bit made about one person, three person, and we could spend a few hours on that. But I think a couple of things have to be said about that. Number one, in the context of what Van Til is saying, he's absolutely right. And number two, what he's not doing is setting out for us a new Trinitarian dictum that the church now is meant to be pronouncing, one person, three person. That is not what he wanted to do. He understood the difference very well between person and nature and person and being and essence and all those things. He was schooled in those things and understood that completely. But there was, in the context of some theology, there was thinking that I think probably is still around today, that the oneness of God was an abstraction from which three persons then would draw certain attributes and properties. Yeah. And Van Til's point was, you can't think that way. The oneness is God, is the personal God. And so there's a legitimacy to saying that one person, three person, although in saying that, I think Van Til was very well aware of the fact that he's not using person in the historic sense of the way it's been used. And so that's going to make some, particularly church historians, kind of uncomfortable. And I think it would make Van Til uncomfortable if he thought that people were then attributing to him a new Trinitarian dictum. That's not what he was trying to do.
And the interesting thing is, I mean, you find virtually